Reconstruction was a governmental act on the part of federal, local, and state governmental bodies to reintegrate the southern states into the United States and to integrate the African population recently freed into full citizenship.
And so this was a moment that defined two things. First, who these former slaves would be in terms of our legal system. And second, and often overlooked, is that the Reconstruction period also defined the relationship that the federal government would have with states.
When the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, people call it the slaves were freed. These people were not freed. They were released. They were let go. And they were let go into a society that had no interest or place for them.
The Emancipation Proclamation was not a humanitarian act. Instead, it was a proclamation, which we need to focus in on what that means, because a proclamation allows an executive officer, in this case it would have been the president, to enact legislation essentially without going through the challenges of having to go before Congress to get a majority vote. So this was a wartime measure just to free certain bodies so that they're able to help me in this war that I have called the Civil War. And it was that act that led to the ultimate passage of the 13th Amendment, which accomplishes two things. The initial part of it says that slaves are now free. There's no such thing as slavery anymore, but it accepts in instances where a person is in custody for a crime. And the second part of the 13th Amendment cloaks the federal government with the authority to enforce. And the thinking was that if we don't do some level of enforcement, the southern states will just default to doing what they were doing. So it gave the authority to the federal government to actually make sure that the southern states did not, in fact, go back and re-enslave these people after this big civil war had just ended. What the 14th Amendment did is said from this moment forward, you are in fact a citizen. And citizenship grants you all of the rights and protection of the Constitution. And so it converted these enslaved people from property to actual people and gave them great hope, I might add. The 15th Amendment was the last of the Reconstruction Amendments, and it on paper granted the right to vote to African American men.
Here in Louisiana, there was a new constitution passed in 1868. That constitution provided for the first time universal male suffrage. This way, African Americans could register to vote. And because they were 3/4, if not 4/5 of the population of these rural parishes, they were able to gain the local and the state seats, and even in the United States Senate and Congress to represent Louisiana.
We even had a black governor. I'm thinking, well, how did that happen? I never could imagine a time, seeing the way Jim Crow was, when they would have ever elected a black man to anything.
And then terror started, lynching started.
There was a lot of violence, there was a lot of voter intimidation, preventing the majority of African American voters from going to the polls. And of course, the Jim Crow laws come in 1896.
So around 1896, we would have seen about 95% of blacks voting. Within 5 years, it was only 1%. The law was used to suppress the vote. And a lot of people don't make the connection that these slave owners, they didn't just retire and say, okay, now my plantation was just destroyed by the Civil War, I'm retired now. What they did was just seek a new profession. And so many of them left the plantation, traded in the former suit, and put on the legislative wear, and went into the legislature and began to orchestrate the movement in the legislature to, in fact, continue this thing called slavery, maybe by another name.